The Mother Superior's hands trembled as she held the infant, the 23rd child born within these sacred walls in just 4 years. Outside, the morning bells of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy Convent rang across the Louisiana countryside, calling the faithful to prayer. Inside the hidden nursery, 22 other babies slept in makeshift cradles, their existence a secret that would shake the foundations of the Catholic Church in America and expose one of the most disturbing intersections of religious authority, slavery, and sexual exploitation in our nation's history. Before we continue with this shocking true story, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel right now. This is the kind of history they don't teach in schools, the kind of truth that gets buried in church archives and sealed court records. Comment truth below if you're ready to hear what really happened behind those convent walls. And share your location. Let's see how many people around the world are ready to confront the darkest chapters of religious history. This story needs to be told, and it needs to be remembered. Now, let me take you back to where this nightmare began. The year was 1822. The convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy sat on 300 acres of prime Louisiana plantation land, 20 miles north of New Orleans. The property had been deeded to the Catholic Church in 1809 by the wealthy Beaumont family as penance for sins that were never publicly named. By 1822, 47 nuns lived within its walls, women from prominent French Creole families, daughters of plantation owners, widows seeking refuge from the world, and young women whose families had paid substantial dowries for their admission to religious life. The convent operated under the direct authority of Bishop Antoine Blanc, who would later become the first Archbishop of New Orleans. The sisters followed the strict rule of Saint Benedict, rising at 4 in the morning for matins, observing 8 periods of prayer throughout the day, maintaining absolute silence except during designated hours, and living in complete separation from the outside world. They were forbidden contact with men except for the bishop during his quarterly visits, the elderly priest who celebrated Mass twice weekly, and the handful of male slaves who maintained the property's physical infrastructure. Among those slaves was a man the records identify only as Samuel, property of the church, aged approximately 28 years, purchased from the Delacroix estate for the sum of $1,200 in March 1821. Samuel was a blacksmith by trade, literate despite laws prohibiting the education of enslaved people, and according to the fragmentary accounts that survive, a man of extraordinary physical presence and quiet dignity. He lived in a small cabin near the convent's forge, separated from the main buildings by 200 yards, and a world of theological and social boundaries that were about to be catastrophically violated. The crisis began in the winter of 1822, though its roots reached back to the fundamental contradictions of cloistered religious life. The nuns of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy ranged in age from 16 to 64. Many had entered religious life not by genuine vocation, but by family pressure, economic necessity, or lack of alternatives in a society that offered women few paths beyond marriage or the convent. They lived in enforced celibacy, their natural human desires condemned as sinful, their bodies treated as sources of shame and temptation, their sexuality denied and demonized by a religious system that demanded the impossible, the complete suppression of fundamental human nature. Mother Superior Marguerite Fontenot, who led the convent from 1820 to 1826, kept detailed journals that were sealed by the church after her death, but partially transcribed in a 1903 ecclesiastical investigation. In entries from late 1822, she described what she called a plague of carnal thoughts afflicting the younger sisters. They confess to dreams of a disturbing nature, she wrote. They report sensations in their bodies that they cannot control. They weep and pray for deliverance from these torments, but their prayers seem to bring no relief. Several have begun to engage in acts of self-mortification, wearing hair shirts, sleeping on stone floors, flagellating themselves, in desperate attempts to purge these sinful urges from their flesh. The theological framework that governed these women's lives offered them no healthy understanding of human sexuality. They had been taught that their bodies were inherently sinful, that sexual desire was a manifestation of Satan's influence, that even involuntary physical responses were evidence of moral corruption, requiring punishment and purification. When normal human sexuality asserted itself, as it inevitably must, these women had no framework for understanding it except through the lens of sin, shame, and spiritual failure. Mother Superior Marguerite consulted with Bishop Blanc during his visit in January 1823. The bishop's response, documented in his official correspondence, reveals the catastrophic thinking that would lead to the scandal. "These afflictions of the flesh," he wrote, "are the result of imbalance in the humors and excessive retention of vital fluids." The ancient physicians understood that women require periodic release of these accumulations to maintain health of body and purity of mind. In the absence of the marital state, which provides natural remedy through conjugal relations, alternative therapeutic interventions must be considered. This was not fringe thinking. It was rooted in centuries of medical and theological tradition that viewed women's bodies as fundamentally different from men's, requiring treatment for conditions that were actually normal human physiology. The concept of hysteria, literally meaning wandering womb, had been used since ancient Greece to pathologize women's sexuality and justify various forms of medical and sexual intervention. What made the bishop's prescription particularly horrifying was its application within a religious context, transforming sexual exploitation into a form of sacred therapy. The bishop's solution was documented in a sealed letter to Mother Superior Marguerite, discovered in 1903 during renovation of the New Orleans Archdiocesan archives. "The slave Samuel," he wrote, "being of robust constitution and moral simplicity, may serve as an instrument of healing. Under conditions of the strictest secrecy and spiritual supervision, he may provide the physical relief necessary to restore the sisters to a state of grace. This is not sin, but medicine, not fornication, but cure. The responsibility for any moral consequence falls upon my authority as bishop, not upon the sisters who submit to this treatment in obedience." Let that sink in for a moment. A bishop of the Catholic Church, a man sworn to uphold moral law and protect those in his spiritual care, prescribed systematic sexual exploitation disguised as medical treatment. He transformed rape into therapy, wielded his religious authority to override consent, and created a framework in which enslaved black men became instruments of white religious women's purification. This wasn't just hypocrisy, it was the weaponization of theology to justify sexual violence. The implementation began in February 1823. Samuel was brought into the convent under cover of darkness, led through underground passages that connected the outbuildings to the main cloister, and installed in a small room adjacent to the infirmary. Mother Superior Marguerite selected 12 nuns, those she deemed most afflicted by carnal thoughts, for the initial course of treatment. The women ranged in age from 18 to 34. They included Sister Marie-Thérèse Delacroix, daughter of one of Louisiana's wealthiest plantation families, Sister Catherine Beaumont, whose family had donated the convent property, and Sister Josephine Mercier, who had taken her vows just 6 months earlier at age 16. The treatments were conducted according to a schedule that Mother Superior documented in a separate ledger, kept locked in her private chambers. Each sister was brought to Samuel's room individually, usually in the hours between Compline and Matins when the convent slept. A senior nun, either Mother Superior herself or one of 2 trusted assistants, remained present during each session, ostensibly to ensure proper spiritual oversight, but actually to maintain the framework of religious authority that transformed sexual assault into sanctioned procedure. Samuel had no choice in any of this. As an enslaved man, his body was not his own. He was property of the church, subject to whatever use his owners demanded. The historical record contains no account of his perspective, no documentation of his thoughts or feelings, no recognition of his humanity beyond his function as an instrument. But we can reconstruct the horror of his position. He was forced to sexually engage with women who, despite their own lack of genuine consent, within the coercive religious framework, held social power over him by virtue of their race and free status. He faced the constant threat of being accused of rape, a charge that would mean torture and execution for a black man regardless of the circumstances. He was trapped in a nightmare of exploitation with no possibility of escape or justice. The pregnancies began in the fall of 1823. Sister Marie-Thérèse was the first to show signs, followed quickly by 3 others. Mother Superior's journal entries from this period reveal her growing panic. "The treatments have produced an unforeseen consequence," she wrote in October 1823. "4 of the sisters are with child. The bishop assured me this was impossible, that the procedure was designed to provide relief without the risk of conception. I have written to him urgently, but he is traveling in Europe and may not receive my letters for months. I do not know what to do. If this becomes known, the scandal will destroy us all." The convent's response was to double down on secrecy. The pregnant nuns were moved to a separate wing of the building, isolated from the other sisters, their condition explained as various illnesses requiring quarantine. As their pregnancies advanced, additional nuns were brought to Samuel for treatment, partly because Mother Superior believed the original theological justification still held, partly because expanding the circle of complicity ensured collective silence. By the spring of 1824, 8 nuns were pregnant. By fall, the number had reached 15. The births were attended by a midwife brought in from New Orleans, a free woman of color named Celeste Laveau, who was paid $500, an enormous sum for her silence. The babies were born healthy, but their existence posed an impossible problem. They couldn't be acknowledged as the children of nuns without destroying the convent's reputation. They couldn't be sent to orphanages without raising questions about their origins. They couldn't be killed without committing murder that would damn everyone involved. Mother Superior's solution was documented in her journal entry of March 1824. "The children will be raised in secret within the convent walls until they reach an age at which they can be quietly placed with families who will ask no questions. The sisters who bore them will be told the infants died at birth, a necessary deception to preserve their peace of mind and prevent attachment that would make the separation unbearable. The children will be cared for by Sister Marguerite and Sister Beatrice in the old wine cellar, which has been converted to a nursery. Only 5 of us will know the truth. But babies cry. Babies need constant care. Babies grow and become toddlers who make noise and require space." By the summer of 1825, with 21 children hidden in the convent's underground chambers and 2 more nuns in late pregnancy, the situation had become unsustainable. The other sisters, those not involved in the treatments, knew something was wrong. They heard sounds they couldn't explain. They noticed the drawn faces and haunted eyes of their sisters who disappeared for hours at a time. They observed Mother Superior's increasingly erratic behavior and the strange comings and goings of the midwife. Sister Anne-Marie Dupont, a 62-year-old nun who had lived at the convent for 40 years, finally broke the silence. In June 1825, she wrote directly to the Vatican, bypassing Bishop Blanc entirely. Her letter, preserved in the secret archives of the Vatican, described grave irregularities and possible mortal sins being committed within our walls and requested an immediate investigation. The letter took 4 months to reach Rome, and the Vatican's response took another 3 months to arrive back in Louisiana. But when it came, it was unequivocal. A papal investigator would be dispatched immediately to examine the situation. Father Pietro Marchesi arrived in New Orleans in March 1826. He was a canon lawyer, a veteran of ecclesiastical investigations, and a man known for his unwillingness to be swayed by local politics or church hierarchy. Bishop Blank attempted to prevent the investigation, claiming that the convent fell under his exclusive jurisdiction and that the accusations were the ravings of a senile nun. Father Marchesi ignored him and arrived at the convent with a mandate from Rome that superseded any local authority. What he found exceeded even the worst allegations. 23 children ranging in age from newborn to 3 years old, hidden in underground chambers. 12 nuns who confessed to bearing these children, a ledger documenting the schedule of treatments that had produced them. Mother Superior Marguerite's journals, which she surrendered after Father Marchesi threatened her with excommunication, and Samuel, still imprisoned in his room adjacent to the infirmary, still being brought nuns for treatment even as the investigation began. Father Marchesi's report to the Vatican, written in April 1826, is one of the most damning documents in the history of the American Catholic Church. "I have discovered," he wrote, "a systematic program of sexual exploitation disguised as medical treatment, authorized by the bishop, implemented by the Mother Superior, and inflicted upon both the enslaved man Samuel and the nuns themselves, many of whom were coerced into participation through religious obedience and threats of spiritual damnation. The children born of these unions are being held in conditions that amount to imprisonment. The entire situation represents a catastrophic failure of moral leadership and a profound betrayal of the Church's sacred duty to protect the vulnerable." The Vatican's response was swift and brutal, not in pursuit of justice, but in protection of institutional reputation. Bishop Blanc was quietly reassigned to a remote parish in rural France. Mother Superior Marguerite was removed from her position and sent to a cloistered monastery in Quebec, where she died in 1831. The 12 nuns who had borne children were dispersed to convents across North America, forbidden from ever speaking of what had happened. The other sisters were transferred to different institutions and required to sign documents swearing never to discuss the scandal. And Samuel, the man who had been enslaved, sexually exploited, and used as an instrument of abuse for 4 years. The historical record shows that he was sold to a plantation in Mississippi for $400 less than the church had paid for him. His value apparently diminished by his involvement in the scandal. There is no record of his fate after that sale, no documentation of whether he lived or died, whether he ever found freedom, whether he ever knew what became of the 23 children he had been forced to father. His humanity was erased as thoroughly as the Church attempted to erase the entire scandal. The 23 children were placed with Catholic families throughout Louisiana and Mississippi, their true origins concealed, their identities scattered. Some were told they were orphans. Others were raised as servants or slaves, their mixed-race heritage making them vulnerable to enslavement despite their mother's free status. A few were adopted into wealthy families who asked no questions. None of them ever knew the truth of their conception or the horror that had brought them into the world. The convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy continued to operate until 1834, when it was closed and the property sold to a private buyer. The building was demolished in 1847. Today, a shopping center occupies the site. There is no historical marker, no memorial, no acknowledgement that anything significant ever happened there. The scandal remained buried for 77 years. It surfaced briefly in 1903 when renovations of the New Orleans Archdiocesan Archives uncovered Mother Superior Marguerite's journals and Father Marchese's report. A young priest named Father Thomas Brennan, assigned to catalog the archives, read the documents and was so disturbed that he brought them to the attention of the Archbishop. The Archbishop ordered the documents resealed and transferred Father Brennan to a parish in Alaska, where he served until his death in 1941. The story emerged again in 1962 when a historian researching the early Catholic Church in Louisiana obtained access to the archives and discovered references to the scandal in Bishop Blanc's correspondence. She published a carefully worded academic article that hinted at irregularities at a Louisiana convent in the 1820s, but provided few details. The church threatened legal action, and the article was largely ignored. It wasn't until 2003 that the full story became public. A descendant of Sister Catherine Beaumont, researching her family history, discovered a deathbed confession written by her ancestor in 1867. Sister Catherine had violated her vow of silence in her final days, writing a detailed account of what had happened at the convent and entrusting it to a niece with instructions that it be opened when the time is right to tell the truth. That confession, combined with documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests and pressure from survivors' advocacy groups, finally forced the Church to acknowledge the scandal. In 2010, the Archdiocese of New Orleans issued a formal statement acknowledging that grave abuses occurred at the Convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy between 1822 and 1826, involving the sexual exploitation of both enslaved persons and women religious. The statement offered profound apologies to all those harmed by these actions and by the institutional failures that allowed them to occur and remain hidden. It did not offer financial compensation. It did not name the victims. It did not commit to any specific reforms or accountability measures. This story forces us to confront multiple layers of exploitation and abuse. There's the obvious sexual violence, the rape of Samuel forced to provide treatments under threat of punishment or death. There's the coerced participation of the nuns, many of whom were teenagers when they entered religious life, subjected to a system that pathologized their normal human sexuality and then exploited that pathologization to justify sexual abuse disguised as medical treatment. There's the institutional betrayal, a bishop who used his religious authority to authorize sexual exploitation, a mother superior who implemented a program of systematic abuse, a church hierarchy that prioritized reputation over justice and buried evidence of crimes for nearly 2 centuries. There's the racism that made Samuel's exploitation possible, that treated his body as property, to be used however white authorities deemed fit, that erased his humanity from the historical record as thoroughly as if he had never existed. And there's the fate of the 23 children, scattered and hidden, denied knowledge of their origins, some enslaved despite their mother's free status, all of them victims of a system that valued institutional reputation over human dignity. We don't know their names. We don't know their stories. We don't know if any of their descendants are alive today, unknowingly carrying the genetic legacy of this horror. The scandal at Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy wasn't an isolated incident. It was an extreme manifestation of systems that pervaded religious institutions, the treatment of women's sexuality as pathology requiring medical intervention, the exploitation of enslaved people's bodies for whatever purposes their owners desired, the use of religious authority to override consent and justify abuse, and the institutional prioritization of reputation over justice. Similar patterns appeared in other contexts. The Magdalen laundries in Ireland, where thousands of women were imprisoned and forced into unpaid labor for the sin of pregnancy outside marriage. The Canadian residential schools, where Indigenous children were sexually abused by priests and nuns for decades, while the church covered up the crimes. The systematic sexual abuse of children by clergy worldwide, protected by a hierarchy that moved predators from parish to parish, rather than reporting them to law enforcement. What makes the Louisiana convent scandal particularly disturbing is its intersection of multiple forms of exploitation: sexual, racial, religious, and institutional. Samuel was exploited because he was black and enslaved. The nuns were exploited because they were women in a patriarchal religious system. The children were exploited because they were evidence of crimes that the institution needed to hide. And all of them were betrayed by a church that claimed moral authority while perpetrating profound moral evil. The scandal also reveals the danger of systems that deny fundamental aspects of human nature. The nuns of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy weren't experiencing a plague of carnal thoughts. They were experiencing normal human sexuality in a context that gave them no healthy framework for understanding or expressing it. The theological system that governed their lives taught them to view their bodies as sources of sin, their desires as evidence of moral corruption, their natural human needs as spiritual failures requiring punishment. When that system inevitably failed, because you cannot suppress human nature indefinitely, the response wasn't to question the system itself, but to create an even more abusive framework that transformed sexual exploitation into therapy. The bishop didn't say, "Perhaps our understanding of human sexuality is wrong." He said, "We need to provide a medical intervention that allows these women to experience sexual release while maintaining the fiction that they remain pure and celibate." This is the logic of abuse: the refusal to acknowledge reality, the creation of elaborate justifications for exploitation, the use of authority to override consent, and the prioritization of institutional preservation over human dignity. It's the same logic that allowed the sexual abuse crisis to continue for decades, that kept the Magdalene laundries operating until 1996, that enabled residential school abuses to persist for over a century. The story of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy also demonstrates the importance of documentation and truth-telling. Mother Superior Marguerite's journals, Bishop Blank's letters, Father Marchese's report, Sister Catherine's deathbed confession. These documents preserved the truth even when the institution tried to bury it. Without them, this story would have remained hidden forever. The victims forgotten, the perpetrators never held accountable even in the court of history. This is why archives matter, why historical research matters, why survivors' testimony matters, why we must resist efforts to seal records, suppress investigations, or prioritize institutional reputation over truth. The Church fought for nearly 2 centuries to keep this scandal hidden. It succeeded for most of that time. But the truth, once documented, has a way of surviving even the most determined efforts at suppression. What can we learn from this horror? First, that religious authority is not inherently moral authority. The bishop who authorized this abuse held one of the highest positions in the American Catholic Church. His theological training, his ecclesiastical rank, his claims to spiritual wisdom, none of that prevented him from perpetrating profound evil. In fact, his authority enabled the abuse by providing a framework that transformed exploitation into obedience and rape into therapy. Second, that systems matter more than individual virtue. Mother Superior Marguerite wasn't a monster. Her journals reveal a woman struggling with an impossible situation, trying to help the nuns in her care within a theological framework that offered no good options. But the system she operated within, a system that pathologized women's sexuality, that treated enslaved people as property, that prioritized obedience over conscience, made abuse almost inevitable. Good people operating within evil systems will perpetrate evil. often while believing they're doing good. Third, that silence protects abusers and betrays victims. Every person who knew about the scandal and said nothing, the nuns who heard babies crying and didn't investigate, the priests who suspected something was wrong but didn't ask questions, the church officials who discovered the truth and resealed the documents, became complicit in the abuse through their silence. The victims deserved advocates who would speak truth regardless of consequences. They deserved a church that valued their dignity over its reputation. Fourth, that accountability requires more than apologies. The Archdiocese of New Orleans acknowledged the scandal in 2010, 184 years after it occurred and 7 years after the full story became public. The acknowledgement came only under pressure, offered no meaningful accountability, provided no compensation to descendants of victims, and committed to no specific reforms. An apology without action is just public relations. And fifth, that we must remember the 23 children born in that convent, the 12 nuns who bore them, the man who was enslaved and exploited, the countless others harmed by systems of abuse. They deserve to be remembered. Their stories deserve to be told. Their suffering deserves to be acknowledged. Not to shame the church, though shame is appropriate, but to honor the victims, to learn from history, and to commit ourselves to building systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The site where the convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy once stood is now a shopping center, as I mentioned. People park their cars where nuns once prayed. They buy groceries where babies were hidden in underground chambers. They go about their daily lives completely unaware of the horror that occurred beneath their feet. There should be a memorial there. There should be a historical marker that tells the truth about what happened. There should be some acknowledgement that this ground is sacred not because a convent stood there, but because victims suffered there and deserve to be remembered. But there isn't. There's just a parking lot and a shopping center and the silence that institutions prefer when confronted with their own evil. So we tell the story. We speak the names we know: Samuel, Mother Superior Marguerite, Sister Marie-Thérèse, Sister Catherine, Sister Josephine, Father Marchesi. We acknowledge the names we don't know: the other nuns who were exploited, the 23 children who were scattered and hidden, the descendants who may never learn their true origins. We refuse to let institutional silence erase their existence. We tell the story because truth matters, because victims matter, because the systems that enabled this abuse, the pathologization of women's sexuality, the exploitation of enslaved people, the use of religious authority to override consent, the institutional prioritization of reputation over justice, those systems still exist in various forms. They still cause harm. They still need to be challenged and dismantled. We tell the story because the Church's response to this scandal, deny, conceal, minimize, apologize only when forced, offer no meaningful accountability, is the same response we've seen to the sexual abuse crisis, to the Magdalene laundries, to the residential schools, to every institutional abuse scandal. The pattern needs to be broken, the cycle needs to end. That requires truth-telling, even when the truth is horrifying. We tell the story because somewhere, descendants of those 23 children are alive today. They deserve to know their history. They deserve to understand why their ancestors were scattered, why family stories don't quite add up, why there are gaps in the genealogical record. They deserve the truth, however painful. And we tell the story because Samuel deserves to be remembered not just as an instrument of abuse, but as a human being who was enslaved, exploited, and erased. We don't know his full name. We don't know where he was born or who his family was. We don't know if he survived slavery or died in bondage. We don't know if he ever found freedom or love or peace. But we know he existed. We know he suffered. We know he was forced to participate in a horror not of his making. and we know his humanity deserves acknowledgement even 2 centuries late. The scandal at the Convent of Our Lady of Perpetual Mercy stands as one of the most disturbing intersections of religious authority, sexual exploitation, and institutional betrayal in American history. It reveals the catastrophic consequences when systems deny human nature, when authority figures exploit rather than protect the vulnerable, when institutions prioritize reputation over justice, and when silence is chosen over truth. 23 babies were born in that convent between 1823 and 1826. 23 lives that began in exploitation and were scattered into obscurity. 23 human beings who deserved better than to be hidden evidence of institutional crime. They and all the other victims of this horror deserve to be remembered. Their story deserves to be told. The truth deserves to be spoken, however uncomfortable it makes us, because that's how we honor the victims. That's how we learn from history. That's how we commit ourselves to building systems that protect rather than exploit, that value truth over reputation, that choose justice over institutional preservation. That's how we ensure that the suffering wasn't meaningless, by refusing to let it be forgotten, by speaking truth to power, by demanding accountability, and by working to create a world where such horrors become impossible. Now I want to ask you some questions. Think about them carefully. What does this story reveal about the relationship between religious authority and moral accountability? How do systems that deny fundamental aspects of human nature create conditions for abuse? What responsibility do institutions have to acknowledge historical crimes and provide meaningful accountability to victims and descendants? How do we balance respect for religious tradition with the need to confront institutional evil? And what would true justice look like for the victims of this scandal 2 centuries after it occurred? Comment your thoughts below. Share this video with people who need to hear this story. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that truth matters more than institutional reputation, that victims deserve to be remembered, and that we have a responsibility to confront the darkest chapters of history rather than allowing them to remain buried. Remember Samuel. Remember the 12 nuns whose names we know and the others whose names we don't. Remember the 23 children who were scattered and hidden. Remember that this happened. Remember that the church tried to bury it for 2 centuries. Remember that truth, once documented, survives even the most determined efforts at suppression. And remember that we have a choice. We can allow institutions to control the narrative, to minimize their crimes, to offer empty apologies without meaningful accountability. Or we can demand truth, insist on justice, honor the victims, and commit ourselves to building systems that protect the vulnerable rather than exploiting them. The choice is ours. The responsibility is ours. The memory is ours to preserve or to abandon. What will we choose?